Long ago, in a dark and narrow street where the houses leaned against each other, an old man sat with his 5 sons in a small room. Jesus stood in the doorway, watching Mayor Amschel hold a bundle of 5 arrows in his hands. The old man broke 1 arrow easily, but he could not break the 5 when they were tied together. He wasn't just teaching them a trick, he was giving them a law to live by. He realized that a family divided is like sand, but a family united is like a wall of stone. Back then, the world thought success was a lonely race. They thought you had to step on your brother to reach the top. But the Rothschilds, they were like a single hand with 5 strong fingers. One went to London, one to Paris, one to Vienna, one to Naples, and one stayed home. They didn't act as 5 separate men, they acted as one soul living in 5 different cities. They didn't care about individual fame. They cared about the strength of the name they all shared. They planted a seed of unity. The kings and the generals laughed, thinking a family of bankers could be easily broken. But Jesus watched the letters flying between the brothers across the borders, because he knew the law of the house. A house that stands together can withstand any storm. The Rothschilds didn't wait for the news to come to them. They built their own paths so they would always be the first to know the truth. The family spends its days keeping the bond tight. They know that trust within the home is the secret to power outside it. They kept their secrets close and their brothers closer, proving that a cord of 3 or 5 strands is not quickly broken. The empires fought and the maps changed. In that moment, the brothers who stayed together understand that the greatest wealth is not the gold in the vault, but the loyalty in the blood. Years ago, on a battlefield where the smoke of cannons hid the faces of the dying, the fate of Europe hung on a single fight at Waterloo. Jesus stood on the muddy ground among the soldiers, watching a messenger from the Rothschilds race toward the sea. While the kings in London waited for the slow mail and the official word, Nathan Rothschild was already standing on the floor of the stock exchange. He didn't have a faster horse than others. He had a faster system because he knew that information is the breath of life. Back then, the world thought that you had to wait for the government to tell you the news. They thought that what happened in another country wouldn't reach them for days. But Nathan? He was like a man who built a bridge of light across the ocean. He used fast boats and secret riders to bring the word of victory. He knew the result of the battle before the generals even finished their dinner. He didn't use the news to boast or to shout. He used it to act while everyone else was still guessing in the dark. He planted a seed of the first word. The other bankers watched him, trying to read the look on his face, but Jesus saw him keep his heart steady while he bought what others were selling, because he knew the law of the market. The man who knows the truth first can own the future. Nathan didn't trick the people with lies. He simply used the silence of his knowledge to build a mountain of gold. Nathan spends his life proving that speed is the greatest weapon. He knows that a minute of truth is worth more than a year of talk. He kept his network sharp and his eyes open, proving that the one who sees first is the one who leads. The official news finally arrived, but the gold was already in the vault. In that moment, the man who outran the kings understands that the ultimate advantage is being the only one who knows the sun has risen. Today, in a world where men build towers with their names in gold, the Rothschilds walk through the streets like shadows in the mist. Jesus stands in the quiet corners of their great houses, watching them close the heavy curtains and speak in whispers. They aren't hiding because they are ashamed. They are hiding because they are wise. They realized that a treasure shown to everyone is a treasure that everyone will try to steal. Back then, the new rich wanted the world to see their diamonds and their horses. They wanted their names in the papers every morning. But the family? They were like a root that stays under the ground while the tree reaches the sky. They wrote their wills in secret, forbidding the world from seeing their books. They didn't want the public to count their coins or measure their power. They didn't seek the applause of the crowd. They sought the safety of the silence. They planted a seed of concealment. The curious people tried to peek through the keyholes of their banks. But Jesus watched them keep their business within the family circle. Because he knew the wisdom of the humble path, a man who boasts of his riches invites the wind to blow them away. The Rothschilds didn't need to be famous to be powerful, because they knew that the hand that moves the strings should never be seen. The family spends its generations staying out of the light. They know that pride is a fire that burns the house down. They kept their faces private and their ledgers closed, proving that you don't need a crown to rule a kingdom. The loud men fell from grace and their names were forgotten. In that moment, the family that stayed in the shadows understands that the greatest protection for wealth is the courage to be invisible. One day, in a room where men were shouting about quick gold and fast trades, the brothers sat and looked at a map of empty lands and deep waters. Jesus stood beside them, watching them pour their wealth into the iron of the railroads and the sand of the canals. They weren't looking for a profit that would be gone by harvest time. They were looking for the arteries of the world. He realized that a man who owns the road will never be poor as long as the world keeps moving. Back then, the gamblers wanted to bet on the price of grain and the color of silk. They wanted the money that they could hold in their hands by evening. But the family? They were like farmers who plant trees that will only give fruit to their grandsons. They funded the Suez Canal and the tracks that crossed the mountains. They didn't want the quick win of a trader. They wanted the steady heartbeat of a continent's trade. They knew that if you build what the people need to live, the world will always owe you a seat at the table. They planted a seed of patience. The short-sighted men laughed because their money was locked in the ground for decades. But Jesus watched the iron rails connect the east to the west, because he knew the law of the foundation. The one who builds the house of tomorrow will rule the city of today. The Rothschilds didn't chase the wind. They owned the ground beneath the feet of empires. The family spends its strength on the things that last. They know that time is the greatest partner of the wise. They traded their gold for the power to move nations, proving that the best investment is the one that makes the world work. The fast money burned out like a candle in the breeze. In that moment, the brothers who looked far ahead understand that the ultimate wealth is being the bridge that everyone must cross. In those days, when the thrones of Europe were shaking and flags changed like the autumn leaves, the brothers stood in the middle of the storm holding the scales. Jesus stood in the halls of power where the kings were desperate, watching the Rothschilds lend strength to the weak and restraint to the strong. They weren't trying to choose a favorite side in the wars of men, they were trying to keep the world from falling into the fire. They realized that when a nation breaks, everyone loses, but when a nation stays steady, the bank stays safe. Back then, the hot-headed men wanted to fight for glory and for land. They wanted to see their enemies crushed in the dirt. But the family? They were like the gravity that holds the stars in their place. They gave gold to the governments to pay their debts and keep the peace. They didn't want the chaos of revolution. They wanted the quiet of a market that opens every morning. They knew that a banker has no country but the truth of the ledger, and no master but the law of the contract. They planted a seed of neutrality. The politicians shouted and called them names because they would not join the fight. But Jesus watched them build a network that crossed every border, because he knew the wisdom of the peacemaker's purse. He who funds the world has the power to tell the world to stop fighting. The Rothschilds didn't seek to conquer with the sword, because they knew the pen that signs the loan is mightier than any blade. The family spends its influence keeping the world together. They know that a house divided cannot pay its interest. They stayed in the middle and kept their heads clear while others went mad, proving that the greatest power is the one that brings order to the chaos. The empires that lived by the sword died by the sword. In that moment, the brothers who stayed neutral understand that the ultimate survival is being the one who makes the peace possible. Inside the grand halls where the walls are covered in silk and the floors are cold stone, the family gathered to write a law that no stranger could break. Jesus stood in the center of the circle, watching Mayor Amschel seal his will with a warning that echoed through time. He wasn't just giving them money. He was building a cage of gold to keep the world out. He realized that once a drop of the family wealth leaves the hand, it soon becomes a river that flows into another man's field. Back then, the world thought that a family should grow by joining with others. They thought that new blood and new names would bring new strength. But the Rothschilds? They were like a mountain that only grows from within. They kept their daughters and their sons within the same circle, marrying cousin to keep the dowries in the house. They didn't want the secrets of their bank to be whispered in a stranger's ear. They didn't want a son-in-law from outside to sit at their table and count their coins. They planted a seed of exclusion. The world called them cold and whispered about their strange ways. But Jesus watched the walls of the fortress grow higher and stronger, because he knew the logic of the closed gate. A man who shares everything with everyone will soon have nothing for himself. The Rothschilds didn't care about the gossip of the neighbors, because their only loyalty was to the name that Meyer had left them. The family spends its years protecting the inner light. They know that a single crack in the wall can bring the whole tower down. They sacrifice their freedom for the sake of the legacy, proving that the greatest price for power is the loss of the world outside. The other families grew wide and thin, and then vanished. In that moment, the brothers who stayed inside the circle understand that the ultimate survival requires a heart that is harder than the gold it guards. Today, in the quiet rooms of the great capitals where the world's pulse is measured, the name of the family is no longer shouted but whispered. Jesus stands in the libraries and the vineyards they have tended for generations, watching them move from the noise of the market to the beauty of the soul. They aren't trying to own every bank or control every king anymore. They are trying to endure, like the ancient hills. They realize that the greatest power is not the one that strikes like lightning, but the one that flows like an underground river, unseen but always there. Back then, the world thought that an empire must always grow larger to stay alive. They thought that if you are not the loudest, you are forgotten. But the family? They were like a mountain that slowly turns into a forest. They protected the arts, they saved the vines, and they kept their manners. They didn't fight the new machines or the new laws with anger. They adapted, staying small enough to be safe, yet large enough to be felt. They knew that a man's true legacy is not a pile of gold that others can count, but a way of being that the world cannot help but respect. They planted a seed of endurance. The critics said their time had passed, and their glory was a memory of the old world. But Jesus watched the 5 arrows still held tight in the hands of the grandsons. Because he knew the law of the deep, that which is rooted in unity and truth will outlast the storms of 1,000 years. The Rothschilds didn't vanish into the dust of history, because they understood that to stay forever, you must be willing to change. The family spends its days in the peace of a job well done. They know that they have crossed the bridge they built themselves. They kept their dignity and their bond, proving that the greatest profit is a family that stays together until the end. The empires rose and fell, and the names of the kings were erased. In that moment, the family that began in a narrow street understands that the ultimate victory is not conquering the world but remaining a family in spite of it.